Thank you. It's great to be here at this session on HIV in adolescent girls and young women. And kidding. I did that for Luchika. You should get really upset. I'm not going to actually introduce the panelists because you have them listed before you. And in the interest of time, we'll just go forward and say a little bit about them as we ask questions. So what we're going to try to do in this session is begin at the country level and work our way to the high-level meeting. And hopefully have a good conversation and one that will keep us all awake in this last session before a nice announcement and then Minister Motolete, correct? That's what you're doing after. So, David, let's begin with you. As an NTP manager of a country that has a significant TB and HIV problem, and we are here at the HIV meeting, and it's great that IAS did a TB meeting here for the first time, I think. Second time, good. But tell us, how is it actually going in a country 15 years on after the MDGs and integrating HIV and TB in South Africa, given the fact that the co-infection rate is so enormously high? And then we can talk about some of the countries where that's not necessarily the case, but integration, especially in the area of UHC, is something we should be talking about. So, but why don't we start in South Africa, where you have such a high co-infection rate? And if you could talk a little bit about, has there been any change in the last 15 years? And if there isn't integration, why not? And how do we get over it?
Yeah, thank you very, very much, Mark, and good afternoon to the die-hard members of this meeting. You've managed to stay until so late with us. It's quite a long and packed program, and I think it's because it's pretty much a side event to the IAS, and hopefully in 2 years' time, based on the discussions that we had early in the morning, maybe you're going to be in the IAS itself in 2 years' time. So I will come to the issue of integrating HIV and TB, Mark, just now. But if I could just throw one word regarding the high-level meeting, because it's going to have implications on how we take the work forward, is that heads of state, like other politicians, are likely to just stick to the general statements of reaching everybody without wanting to make very clear commitments, for example, to the targets. We all talk about these key asks, but if you went below each of those high-level asks, there are very specific targets. The 40 million that we have been speaking about, it will be nice if we can have heads of state leaving that meeting and continuing to be very familiar with these numbers, because ultimately that's what is going to drive action. And of course, in South Africa, TB HIV co-infection, it's a major issue. We've had co-infection levels of, at some point, I think it was in excess of 60%. Now we are around 57% or thereabout. And that talks clearly to the need to strengthen the HIV response while also doing the best on TB. And in fact, we have the experience that with a good HIV program that takes TB seriously, you are likely to see a lot of progress. And I believe that the rollout of ARVs and the attempts at routine screening of HIV-infected persons for TB, and earlier on we are all lamenting the low numbers of people who are on preventive therapy, but you saw even from the slides that have been presented that quite a large chunk of that small number is actually coming out of South Africa. So I think the success of the HIV program means a lot of success for the response that has to be made against the TB epidemic.
Thank you, David. thinking back over the last 10 years in South Africa, and my perspective from many trips in different places is that at the beginning it was actually the TB community that was resistant to HIV coming in because they thought they were going to mess up their programs. But now it seems like the HIV, in many places I visited, the money for TB is actually coming, there's money from TB flowing to HIV, but there's not a lot of HIV money flowing to TB despite the disproportionate amount of money. But are you seeing more and more openness among the practitioners and the people who do the implementation to bringing programs together and for a person, or is there's still a lot of tension?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's still a lot of ground that can be covered on this, but I came in 2008. And at the time that I was coming in, it was just after a huge outbreak of drug-resistant TB in one particular province, the province of KwaZulu-Natal. And, there was a lot of pressure, obviously, regarding HIV and AIDS. And it looks like as, good progress was being made regarding the HIV response, attention was not being paid on the TB response, and the outbreak hit in a very big way. So it was almost like try and strengthen the capacity to be able to respond to the TB epidemic first. That's when I came in to help set up what is called the Chief Directorate for TB control and management. So have dedicated attention and focus, and also try and push for more resources to beef up the TB response. But it became very clear soon thereafter that a closer collaboration between the two programs was desirable. And fortunately, at the apex of strategic leadership on TB and HIV in South Africa, we are joined in the sense that we all respond to the very same senior executive. And I mean, there are many things that I can mention in terms of the benefit that is being derived out of a closer collaboration between the TB and HIV programs. The most maybe more recent one in a formidable way is the fact that we are now tapping into resources that originally were HIV resources. And in fact, without going into details, the way that our budgets flow, national government can set targets in terms of monies that have to be made to provinces, but provinces can still decide to utilize those resources as best as they deem necessary. And in that way, we would lose funding that would have been earmarked for both the HIV and the TB program. And what happened was to design a funding mechanism that protected resources for HIV. And as a result, now with TB coming so close to HIV, we are now able to utilize those resources. We wouldn't have succeeded with the 100% rollout of GeneXpert had it not been for us having the ability to access those resources. So there is better cooperation now than it was maybe a couple of years ago.
Thank you, and thank you for being that particular, because sometimes these conversations just get so general, but being very specific around funding mechanisms and how you move things is really important for people to share and understand. Thank you also for raising the political leadership piece and having a minister and a president now who believe deeply in these issues and promote them. So two key things and key lessons for us all. Let's move to another area of the world. And Jeff, the Philippines has been an interesting place. The link between HIV and TB is not as strong as it is in parts of Africa, but nonetheless, as you're moving towards universal health coverage and how those communities can come together, learn from each other, what's your experience and where have you seen things go well and not go so well?
Thanks, Mark. Actually, the first time I got engaged in the TB response in the Philippines was back in 2009, when I was part of the Global Fund principal recipient. And literally, I was part of the HIV program of the Global Fund, funded programs in the Philippines. And the TB program is in a different office, like literally beside our office. And the only time that we discuss TB and HIV, because it's one of our targets as our deliverables, was every quarter when we need to collect the information from the TB office. So that's how it was in 2009. Now, 9 years later, the Philippines is one of the high burden countries. We have, when it comes to TB, so we have 1 case per minute, or 1,600 per day. When it comes to HIV, we have 32 newly diagnosed per day. And can you imagine 16 of those 32 have been diagnosed with tuberculosis. So that's how grave the situation is in the Philippines. But nonetheless, there hasn't been that interest coming from, especially coming from people living with HIV groups. Because while there's this one coalition that has really started the convening of different patient groups from different tertiary hospitals of TB survivors and TB patients, people who have had TB, it's not sustainable. Because there hasn't been really support coming from the National TB Program. And it was really difficult for us, especially in the advocacy component, to really make use of those patient groups, to really join the broader TB and HIV advocacy. But what we've observed recently, especially with this high-level meeting process, was that through the support of the Stop TB Partnership, we were able to gather people living with HIV and hear their issues when it comes to accessing TB services, including access to diagnosis, testing, and also preventive therapy. And we found through the data that only less than 50% have access to preventive therapy in the Philippines. The treatment access among people living with HIV is around 56%. So it's severely low if we compare it to our global TB strategy. And I think this high-level meeting this coming September and the negotiations around the political declaration could have been a good opportunity to really highlight meaningful community engagement. But unfortunately, we weren't able to push for a good target or an indicator to translate meaningful community engagement in the political declaration. But I think this integration of TB and HIV, particularly in using people with HIV's capacity and the mobilization to move forward the TB response at the national level, is really crucial.
So, can you say a little bit more? I mean, with the resistance within the community of people living with HIV or from the HIV community to engaging with TB, where do you think that's coming from, and how do you get over it?
It's not their priority because they really don't know. Because once they graduate from the treatment, they don't see the point of really participating in the advocacy. I myself, who have been diagnosed with HIV and have had TB, only started to realize the importance of why I need to engage more within the TB and the TB-HIV integration. And it's simply because my treatment does not end the level of engagement that requires for the TB response to move forward at the country level.
Yeah.
And we need to translate that into indicators so that when we demand for funding for communities, and I really like what Diane Carter said earlier, to really need to fund advocacy of people who have had TB within the advocacy work, but we don't have any data to support that. When we need that data.
Thank you, and I think that's a great transition to Timur, who is a survivor of TB. But he's also a very powerful advocate for HIV money, in addition to TB money. So he's been willing to take on both. Timur, what's your perspective on all this, especially coming from a region that has a ridiculously high rate of HIV, TB, pretty much every other bad thing you can have in health and other areas? But what's your perspective?
Thank you. Sorry for stealing your mic. Well, the whole issue about us and them, I actually wanted to start it by asking, can people who have nothing to do with TB, who are just interested, who want to know more, but really don't work with TB, raise their hands. Okay, not many. Okay, so I will be using them as a pronoun for HIV community, all right? Because there are not so many of them here. So the thing is, there is lack of integration on so many levels, and probably there are so many reasons. I can name just a few. One is they are fun. We are boring. We're boring, politically correct, and diplomatic. What I can say, diplomatic, my shit, my ass.
You're disproving that.
But seriously, why HIV community is not interested in doing TB work? Because TB work is boring. Because TB is boring. Because there is no fun. Surprisingly, Jeff is in TB movement probably because he's tired of that HIV fun. Have you seen the trolls, the cartoon trolls? There are trolls and Bergens. Bergens are gray and grumpy and, so we are like Bergens. And HIV guys, they're trolls, they're fun, It's like always, there are two types of parties. There are fun parties, sex, drugs, rock and roll. And there are nerd parties. You can't put them together. It's like inviting your friends to a family dinner. It's just not going to work. So, and there is actually the reason why we are not so fun. Because HIV would be really boring and not fun if there was no community. Doctors are boring. People who are affected by the diseases, they are not. They overcome their health issue, their health problem. They sometimes tell their story, which is full of tears. They tell it in a way you will laugh your ass off. Like Karabu, he was at the prison's session here today. His story is not fun, but when he's telling it, you just laugh. And the thing is, it's really the community that makes a change. When we start having more community involvement in TB will be fun. And I mean it. Seriously. Another thing which prevents this interaction, when we speak about my region, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, there is this perception of inadequate resources going into the diseases. So when it comes to HIV and TB, two programs feel like they need to share something. They need to fight for the resources and pull the blanket. They will not be cooperating with each other when they see each other as a competitor. And also, sometimes it feels like, pardon my French, but like a dick measuring contest. Who's better? It's not going to help.
Is this being recorded?
I think it's going to be on YouTube somehow. But anyway,
it's live broadcasted actually.
But there are some childish reasons why there is no integration, especially because it's as simple as that. If we want to have people living with HIV stop dying from TB, HIV services have to include a really proper TB component. If we want people who have TB also make sure that they get adequate care for their HIV infection so that they don't progress to AIDS, then in TB system there has to be something that would accommodate. When a person is in a hospital treating his TB or her TB, that person doesn't need to think about getting ARVs or testing the viral load and getting a CD4 count. It has to be, and somehow it's not working. I'm sorry, I haven't answered your question, but rather I put many other questions. But
do you remember what it was? So. I do think you raised something, Timur, and Jeff too. And we don't have an advocate from Africa, but in Africa, the vast majority of people, a lot of people with HIV, also have had TB, and why the advocacy is on one side mostly and not the other is an interesting question that maybe others could reflect on as we kind of march through. And actually, Kitty, you have kind of a global perspective because KNCB works at pretty all over the place, and you've seen a lot over the years in many different venues. What's your take on where we are? And really, this isn't about us or them, or I'm not going to repeat what Timur said, but it really is about accelerating the response, right? So it's not in isolation to integrate for the sake of integration, or same with UHC. It's how does the response accelerate? So from your perspective from around the world, where do you think we are, not just on integration, but on accelerating the response in the way David talked about in South Africa?
Well, thank you, Mark. First of all, I think the fact that we are so boring is an excellent reason to integrate. And I really see a lot of advances, especially in Africa, which is leading in this context. But just to come back to the Philippines, with the support of the Dutch government, we reached out to an MSM group with great, really very nicely organized social media, testing partners, parties. They have set up a major organization, Love Yourself. They have 300 volunteers. They have diagnosed 100 HIV positives in the last 12 months. We said, why not also look at TB? The results are incredible, and I have the figures in front of me, but by now I know them by heart. We gave them a gene expert machine, we trained them, we set up a referral mechanism. They diagnosed 1,050 HIV positives. They diagnosed among them, they gave all of them a gene expert, and they diagnosed 112 cases, more than 10% TB, active TB, of which 2/3 proven by a gene expert, and all the others they put on IPT. A very simple collaboration. And they are enthusiastic. They like it. So I think things can be done. We shouldn't look for the differences. We should really reach out. And this is a private initiative, and that's something that works more easily. Of course, they work with the support of the National TB Program. What we see are major regional differences. You cannot compare Africa with Central Asia and the rest of Asia. And what we came across several times, that is really hard for the TB community to do the HIV testing. For instance, recently we had an issue in an African country and in another country because the HIV test can only be done by certain technical officers. So it's really these parallel mechanisms, silos. I know you don't like the word vertical, but it's really at the country level, things need to change. There's so many excellent examples under the USH-funded Challenge TB project. Over 3 years, we scaled up the IPT by 38%. Things are moving in the right direction. I hope the HLM will bring that the heads of states really take their responsibility, because we can introduce all the tools in the world, the drugs, connectivity, digital health, but we need the human resources and the infrastructure to bring it together. And I think that just to broaden it to not only HIV, if I would be a patient or the average patients in Asia might prefer to have a diabetes test over an HIV test. We really have to broaden our scope and not only think TB or TB and HIV, but we have countries in Asia where more than 30% of TB patients have diabetes and do not get the care and have a much better treatment response to TB if they would get that diabetes test. And I really enjoyed the last a session. I think we have to embrace the idea, well, we have to embrace getting TB into health insurance schemes, not throwing the child with the bathwater, but you know, we have to jump on that train. I'm talking too long, but so what I want to stress is that things are really moving. And today I heard very few success stories, and there are so many. And I think we should be better at selling those, not selling, but sharing the success stories.
Yeah.
Than we have done so far.
Thanks, Kitty. And thank you for raising universal health coverage, because that is the context now and for global engagement on all health issues. And as Simya mentioned this morning, it was actually the gene expert machines for MDR-TB in Democratic Republic of Congo that were used to identify, to flip cartridges for Ebola. So thank you for raising that issue. Taking a broader global view, Peter, you've been executive director now for a bit. Can't remember when you came in, but you've really put TB on your agenda and been talking about it in almost every setting. It'd be interesting, especially because you didn't come from a health background, why that popped up for you, especially after the slacker who preceded you, didn't really care about TB.
You've stolen my answer. I did have an alternative answer, which is, I'm boring too.
Bankers, doctors.
But after both those answers, why did I focus on TB? Well, a number of different considerations. The first is a simple kind of conundrum, which is that TB gets the smallest share of the Global Fund's resources. It gets 18%. And yet we are the biggest share of external assistance in TB. We represent our 700 million or so a year represents about 2/3 of all external assistance on TB. Indeed, if you take the Global Fund and USAID, there ain't much else. So we play a particularly important role in TB, but it's a rather small amount. A second sort of fact was that as a non-clinician and non-scientist, I spent a lot of my time over the last few months, and I joined at the beginning of March, asking various people who knew more about diseases stupid questions about what did we know about X, why did this happen, why does this work, why did this not work. And the thing that became very apparent to me is that if I asked one question on HIV, I would get an answer that would last sort of 25 minutes and lead into all sorts of different things and tell me about things in the pipeline and all that sort of stuff. And if I asked a similar question about malaria, it was a somewhat shorter answer, but still there were lots of interesting things coming down the pipeline. If I asked the same sort of question about TB, well, many questions, the answer was bedaquiline. And many other questions I asked, there really wasn't an answer, that we didn't really know what the... so it struck me that this was... If I combine the small amount of resources being deployed and the fact that we had seemingly much less scientific knowledge, there was a massive disconnect between that fact, those facts, and the fact that this is now the biggest killer of all infectious diseases, that I think something approaching 40% of deaths among people whose HIV progresses to AIDS are due to TB, and that the level of reductions we've had in TB mortality have been less dramatic than we have seen in HIV and malaria. So on one hand, we don't know much about it. We're not spending as much on it. On the other hand, it's killing a load of people. And then the other factor was that it did seem like we had a bit of a window of opportunity in 2018, because TB is a disease singularly lacking in celebrities or high-profile politicians who are going around talking about it. And all of a sudden, we had two of the sort of most charismatic political leaders, Prime Minister Modi, Cyril Ramaphosa, really beginning to say this is something that they personally wanted to do something about. And if you combine that with also the UN high-level meeting, which is not something we're going to get again for TB for many decades, I should expect. So we need to make most of that opportunity. So with a combination of sort of charismatic, important leadership in high-burden countries, plus the UN high-level meeting, my view was if we couldn't change the trajectory on TB in 2018, well, I'm not quite sure when we will change the trajectory on TB. So I think everyone in the TB community really needs to make sure that we grab this opportunity, that we really push and shove, we get the most amount of senior political representation, that we make it clear that the UN high-level meeting is not just a meeting, it's a kickoff of a process. And that things said there or things unsaid, people will be held accountable to. And that's, so long rambling answer. The first two were probably the more accurate answers. But that's the sort of politically correct answer to your question.
And actually, that's a great lean to what I'm going to ask each of you just to give a very brief answer to, because then we have to open it up. And we do have to end at 6:30 because of the next session. But I did want to recognize, since you mentioned bedaquiline, that Paul Stoffels is sitting in the back of the room. And there are very few people in pharma who actually care about any of this stuff. He's one of them, and we're damn lucky he's around. And I think he'll be around for the rest of the session, at least anyway. But so you raised the high-level meeting, and that if all that we get out of it is a political commitment, which is lovely, that's not enough. So what can be done between now and then, and what needs to be done after to ensure that it's a catalyst for accelerating the response to TB? And I'll ask each of you to answer that question. Kitty, you go first, and then we'll move down. Brief answers so that we can ask others to engage.
The first part, I'm sorry, the first part of the question was?
What needs to be done now, before the high-level meeting, and after the high-level meeting to ensure that it's actually a catalyst for accelerating the response to the TB, not a political commitment only?
I think we all have other roles to play, but the most important thing is to get the heads of state to New York and make a very come with a very clear message, which may be partly a humanitarian. It should be about health security, about AMR, but also about saving cost, because in the end, the cost of no action is going to be immense, and maybe that language is the only one they really understand. I think the accountability framework is important, and accountability at all levels, but I really hope that all of us involved will assist countries at the country level to translate all these the resolution and all the promises into a comprehensive action plan. Thank you.
Peter.
I think the critical thing is around the missing cases and the 4 million, because the good thing about this as a target is it disaggregates by country. And so what we want is the heads of state we can persuade to come knowing that they have to commit to closing that gap and their share of that gap and what that means. And those who decide not to come, we need to make it clear that they are choosing to avoid being held accountable for ultimately the deaths of the people who aren't diagnosed and treated, and that there are hard numbers attached to them not turning up. And then the second thing I think is really important is that we need to rattle the cage of healthcare research institutes, universities, and so on, and say, we need more money, we need more talent poured into the TB arena. Because the tools we got at the moment, we have some good tools, but we also, it's a pretty thin pipeline.
Thanks, Peter. David.
Yeah, go kiss a head of state or something like that. So I think a number of them genuinely do not understand the issues, and they don't have the experience beyond having large numbers thrown at them. And I think, therefore, there's still an opportunity for some engagement and making these more personal than the usual political, rhetorical statements that get made. And very briefly, we had an opportunity, because we are busy working on getting our South African chapter of the Global TB Caucus formally launched, and there was an opportunity for the minister to address, the Speaker of Parliament and speakers from provincial legislatures. And it was in that setting of engagement that the Deputy Speaker of the National Parliament stood up and said, you know what, I had TB twice in my life. My son and wife had MDR-TB, and unfortunately my wife did not survive from having contracted MDR-TB. So you can imagine this room, and it's being said, it's an experience that is being narrated by Deputy. So, and you could see all the changes, and I'm sure similar kind of sharings will helpfully get heads of state to sort of relate to this much more.
Thanks, David. Jeff, very briefly, the thing that needs to be done.
Yeah, I think two things. The first one is sustaining the advocacy, especially the groups that have transitioned from service delivery to advocacy, may it be from people living with HIV, minors, prisoners, even some of the traditional key populations that we know of, such as sex workers, people who inject drugs. The second is, I think after September and moving forward, we need to think about and devise how to come up with an integrated framework that goes beyond diseases. Because I think while looking at diseases is essentially good, we need to go beyond just looking at each and every disease. It's like running after one disease to another. We need to think about how, because when we did the consultations in the Philippines, the issues are almost the same. Access to treatment, stigma and discrimination, financing. We need to think about how can we integrate all these issues, maybe HIV, TB, AMR, so on and so forth. So we need to think about how to do that so that by 2019, we can come up with a more organized and coordinated response engaging in the high-level meeting on UHC. Thanks.
Timur, 30 seconds.
Yeah. So first of all, we have to continue doing what we are doing, which is pushing our governments to be proactively and actively involved in HLM processes and also have heads of states there. But at the same time, to keep our expectations low, especially because it's good psychologically. When you go to a movie and you don't expect that the movie will be brilliant, you will love it. If you come and you expect a lot, it will be a failure, you will be upset. So we have to keep low expectations, but work hard to make sure that everything is good. And then as a community of people affected by TB, whatever the outcome is, no matter how bad the political declaration is, we will find a way to use it to make sure that we achieve what we need.
Thank you. And you just became boring again by wanting low expectations. Fortunately, we have Nick Herbert in the room, who's a member of Parliament, actually runs the TB caucus. And of course, how parliaments engage could be very important for the high-level meeting and how it is a catalyst for response. Nick, can you say a little bit about how members of Parliament can engage and how they can be activated to participate? Yeah, please.
Thank you, Mark, very much indeed. I mean, first of all, the Global TB Caucus has been heavily engaged over the last few months, both in lobbying in our parliaments in the 130 countries that we're represented, with 2,500 parliamentarians now, having set up, I think it's 30 national TB caucuses now, to encourage heads of government to attend the meeting. But also we've been actively involved in the discussions about the wording of the draft declaration. I think there are two challenges. Firstly, we continue to need to try and encourage heads of government to attend. That is in many countries proving a real uphill struggle. Even though we've secured the high-level meeting now in UN General Assembly week, there are still heads of government that are not committing to attend. We need the early adopters to help persuade others and to show the lead that's necessary. I think both the Global TB Caucus but also the whole TB community can't give up on this now. These are now crucial days and weeks where we can persuade heads of government to attend. So we shouldn't just assume that they're going to, because the high-level meeting has been organised. There is a lot of work for us still to do. And secondly, on the issue of accountability, unless we have a very strong accountability mechanism that ensures that words are translated into binding promises, then the declaration, for all that it's welcome, the meeting, for all that it's welcome, becomes just words. We've had declarations before. We had the declaration of a global health emergency before, and since then 50 million people have died. And parliamentarians have a crucial role to play in those national accountability mechanisms by holding leaders' feet to the fire. So I think that the Global TB Caucus, this moment has come. I think it's played a big role in getting us with our partners to this point with the high-level meeting, but I think it will have a role going forward. And that's why support for the caucus and civil society working with the caucus will, I think, continue to be really vital.
Thanks, Nick, and thank you for your continued leadership. I also would just mention that we're also fortunate that we have a DG and deputy DG of WHO who care deeply about TB and have been involved for a very long time. Michelle Sidibe has been very active in TB and recently as well, so we've got a lot of strong leadership. Eric Gooseby as the special envoy. We do have some time for questions from the audience. Unfortunately, I won't be able to participate in it because I have to run and because I don't really care about TB anyway. So, kidding. They're going to moderate the panel discussion. But thank you all.
Thank you. You want to do it? Slide it?
So before we call upon Luchika and Jürgen, as Mark said, we have some time for question and answer for our existing panelists. Okay, sorry.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to share on how to get our heads of states to the high-level meeting. I think it's important for whether you are an activist or you are a legislator to first of all identify who is close to the president. In your own country, you understand your own setup. In my own setup, I knew that my speaker is a close confidant of the president. So when I took the president's letter, I didn't give it to the president's aide. I first of all went to the speaker and gave him the letter and spent some time. But before then, I had asked the Global Caucus to invite the speaker to the high-level meeting also. And the minute I finished explaining, and he said, give me a day to read over this, and the following day came and said, this is fantastic. And then I also used a carrot there. I said, Mr. Speaker, sir, do you know that Zimbabwe is able to treat every TB patient for free, courtesy of the Global Fund? It's not because you have money to do it. It's because somebody else is paying. So at least show commitment by going there and saying thank you. And then, it was done.
Mic number 2.
Yeah, David Bryden with Results. I'm a treatment activist, but I also know that for TB, just as on HIV, treatment alone is not the only thing that's needed. So I wanted to just ask about some of the things that absolutely must be included if we're going to succeed on TB. Psychosocial support, the kind of counseling that people need to get through this terrible disease. Economic support, nutrition support, transportation support. I don't know if maybe one of the panelists might reflect on this and a vision for actually establishing a package that countries could take on and kind of customize. I think that's something that's being worked on, and I'd like to hear more about that.
Okay. Anyone?
I agree it's not about treatment, it's about patient care. And we have had a situation where we had new drugs, bedaquiline, delamanate, everything set up, pharmacovigilance, but no food for patients. No food. So we bought a few cows. And I mean, this is really a problem, that it's either you have the complete package or things fall between the cracks. The moment they got their food, patients improved. And I think in many global funds, budget lines do have transportations, do have incentives, do have the social support. In addition, it's not only the funder, it's also the, for instance, like in Indonesia, the MDR-TB patients themselves set up support groups. Then we build a system for them, a government system, so there's now an umbrella, a network. So it's not only the government or the donor, it's also the community themselves that should be organized to deliver a comprehensive package of care. And so I think we agree, and I think in many settings that's being delivered, and it's also our responsibility to pick up on things like food, or pick up on things that people do not return for the result because of the transportation costs, and get the systems arranged that around the patients, and whether you call it patient-centered care or effective care, but that's what I think we all are striving for.
Did anyone else want to add anything more?
Yeah, just very quickly, not in the forms of the support that you mentioned, but around access to justice, which our partner in the Philippines have been doing. So they've already established this network of lawyers and legal service providers, and they've now integrated issues that are being experienced by people who have had TB in terms of stigma and discrimination. And they're beginning to receive different complaints and cases among people who have had TB. Apart from that, there's also some support that's already coming in our partner in the Philippines to look at legal and laws and policies, and also health inequities in order to address some of the barriers around TB access.
And mic 5, yeah.
Oh, great. I have a very simple question. I was just wondering, you're all sort of navigating the position between policymakers and programmatic issues. And how important do you think economic arguments are to convincing policymakers, particularly at this time? And what types of economic arguments do you think are most important? Thank you.
Economic arguments are important. The second, and I think they're important actually because it's important to dispel a myth that some policymakers have, which is that TB only affects those who are sort of economically inactive or not. And in fact, it doesn't at all. It affects people of economically active age, and it affects people who are both in the informal economy and the formal economy. And I think just shedding light on the sheer scale of the disease and the sheer scale of the impact is important, because I think the point that was made earlier is that a lot of policymakers just simply don't know very much about it. It's not talked about nearly as much. And I found this as I go around explaining to people what I do now, is I say I work for the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria, and a whole bunch of people will talk to me about HIV/AIDS, and a whole bunch of people will talk to me about malaria, and then I will talk to them about TB, because nobody will volunteer a question about TB. So I think reinforcing the message that TB impacts people of economically active age on a large scale, and that is a real drain on the economy, I think it's important for some audiences. There'll be, some audiences won't respond to that, but finance ministers on the whole tend to be quite receptive to that kind of argument, and they are an important part of the equation.
Mic number 5.
Yeah, I'm Daksha Patel from National Coalition of People with HIV in India. There is a big investment till now from the Global Fund in HIV in a community level. So that's why with the treatment, there is so many of the other services, political commitment, we mobilize through the community engagement in the field level. But it's really needs, it is right on time, and now it's a needs in the field to invest in a community, TB disease people. Because unless it will not investment in the community, we cannot get, treatment is okay, but with the other, so many of the needs, package of services, it only and only community can bring in the field level. So now it is the right time to bring HIV experience in the TB also. Thank you.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah.
Mic number 4.
Is it working? Okay. Thank you very much. I think I have 2 issues that I want to comment on. The first one is around resource mobilization. And I was really happy when Peter Sand was expressed interest in moving forward the agenda for TB. But still, we're having challenge when it comes to resource mobilization. And prior to the HLM, I want to know if the Global Fund has any specific activity to lobby our government, to lobby other partners, to put more money on TB, because I think this will also add value to the next replenishment of the Global Fund. And the second one is around integration. The Global Fund has made huge progress to support countries to integrate TB and HIV. But yet we have seen this not moving as we're expecting. Even in the grant negotiation, we have seen that the Global Fund is pushing for TB and HIV integration. I want to know, as the director for Global Fund, if you have any plan or mechanism to push our government to do more integration, because as an advocate, we think integration is contributing a lot to missing people and also even loss to follow-up. We still see when HIV has a vehicle, they will say this is just for HIV. They will not deliver the drug for TB because they said it's for HIV. And this is really challenging to make sure that it happens, not only talking it at global level, but let it be implemented at country level. So I want to know how far you think you can support countries and as well as the HLM. Thank you.
I guess it's for you, Peter.
Sounds like that one's for me. Can I first, however, just quickly respond from the colleague from India who talked about the importance of community response and learning from the HIV experience. I completely agree with you. And I think this is particularly the case because the length of the treatment regimens, they're so unpleasant. You need community support. Otherwise, we just end up with non-adherence to first-line treatment. It generates second MDR-TB, and we actually are backwards as opposed to making progress. On the question of resources, I may be an ex-banker, but I don't print money, sadly. But I do spend a lot of time when I do talk to governments about TB, saying, you know, you've got to spend more money on this. It's as simple as that. You're going to have to spend more money. I would like you to be going and advocating for the donors to give us more money as well, because actually our ability to act as a catalyst for more money through things like co-financing requirements and our ability to persuade people to do things is actually a function of the fact that we turn up with a checkbook. If we don't have a checkbook, we don't have that kind of leverage. If we have a checkbook, we can persuade people to do things. Your point about integration is a really good point. It is frustratingly slow how the barriers between HIV service delivery and TB service delivery. I actually looked it up, and my slacker predecessor, who is obviously worn out and wandered off, but actually, to his credit, it was under his leadership in 2013 that we required countries with significant HIV/TB burdens to submit single concept notes. And actually, we've got something like 34 countries now that have integrated grants. But, 2013 is now 2018, and yet we still have significant issues, as you say, of jostling between the National AIDS Program and the TB support and whether this money goes here and there. And I think this is where actually I think the CCMs need to play a role. I think the CCMs really need to step up, because the CCMs are in a position where they're looking at both diseases. They are the interface between the Global Fund and the country systems. And we need them, because there's only so much the Global Fund can do to sort of push water uphill when it doesn't want to go. But the CCMs could play a critical role in overcoming those sort of silos.
Thank you. Mic number 5.
Yeah, thank you very much. I am Dr. Divakar Tejasvi from India. Just one observation. This high-level meet is having meeting of policymakers, politicians and civil societies. But one very important interface between all these constituents is the practitioner himself, who is coming across daily the patients. And he is knowing in the absence of any very specific diagnostic tool in the rural areas of India or where we don't have any gene experts and like that. So he is also facing lots of first-hand information he's having about the failures, about the resistant TB, about how patients are feeling. So I believe and I think that maybe HLM, if they are taking into account the observations made by these rural physicians and their also observations how to improve upon the things, it will be good. So maybe if HLM and you all think of medical practitioners' point of view also should be taken account. Thank you.
Yeah. Does anyone want to comment on that? Yeah. We actually need to wrap up soon, so perhaps one last question.
Thank you. My name is Mona Balani. I am representing here Touched by TB from India, that is National Coalition of TB Survivors and Affected People, as well as I am also representing National Coalition of People Living with HIV. My just one question is about the owning to the TB HIV community. So it is like, it's our observation as a community, there is some threat to owning the TB HIV community. If we are in the larger platform with the PHIV community, then there are threats because we have lifelong threat to get the TB. I had twice TB after getting HIV, and there are a lot of people who are getting thrice or 4 times TB after getting HIV. But the general community, TB has been cured, and TB is older than HIV. It is 70 years old disease, but still the ownership is very lacking, either in politicians, in donors, in communities, and in civil societies. So that can be now recognized And this is the time. This is the high time. Like I can give the example of India. Now the government of India has started the integration, and like they have initiated some of important steps to integrate both of disease. So I am a person living with HIV. I am a single person. I am a single human, but I am fighting with virus and bacteria both. So the ownership of mine for both bacteria and virus is same. Then why it is different by the donors and stakeholders? That's my point. Thank you.
You want to respond to that, Timur?
As another person who has HIV and had TB in the past, can I tell you one thing? When we spoke about joint applications, funding requests to Global Fund, they come in sometimes in a weird way. Sometimes it's obvious that basically TB program wrote their bit, HIV program wrote their bit. And then someone at the end just spent a couple of hours at best to put it together into one proposal. It's not about ownership sometimes. It's sometimes about too much ownership. And sometimes we have to actually think about why we're doing this, what we're doing this for, and not about our own businesses and, you know, I will play my toys, don't touch my toys, play with your toys, you know. So, I mean, ownership, I don't think there is a problem with ownership. It's just there is too much ownership, I would say. And we have to think about the cause and not about who owns it. So I know that it's slightly not exactly what you were saying, but I see the other side of this issue. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry. I think we have to wrap up. I would like to thank the panelists for I think a great discussion. And we've learned a lot. For one thing, I've learned that the TB world is boring. But hey, isn't there pride in being boring, guys? So thank you very much. And I would now like to call upon, I think we will have a next session here at the table. And I would like to call upon our co-chairs, Luchika and Jogan.